Welcome back, everyone. It's great to have you with us today for another deep dive.
Indeed, it is.
And today we're going to be looking at something that's been in the news a lot lately, a phone call that took place between Putin and Trump. What exactly came out of this conversation between Putin and Trump?
Yeah, what does it signal? I mean, was it just a quick chat, or is there something more to it?
Right, exactly. And what are people saying about it? I mean, because there are a lot of different opinions out there.
Well, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things we really want to get into, because it's not just about the facts of what happened. It's about how people are interpreting those facts.
Yeah, absolutely. And as always, we're going to be looking at this from all sides and trying to, present a balanced view of what's going on.
Exactly, because the truth is often somewhere in the middle.
All right, well, let's jump in. Where do you think we should start?
Well, I think the most logical place to start would be with the White House press release, because that gives us the official account of what happened.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, according to the press release, Putin and Trump, they both emphasized this need for a ceasefire in Ukraine.
Right. Yeah, that was a major point.
And for moving towards some kind of, peace agreement, a lasting peace.
Right, a durable peace.
Yeah.
Be the peace that's going to actually stick.
Yeah, and they also made this point about, all the resources that are being spent on this conflict and how those resources could be better used, in both countries domestically.
That's right. I mean, that's a point that resonates with a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
Regardless of where you stand on the conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, nobody wants to see resources wasted.
Exactly. And especially when there are so many other pressing needs, both in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah. So that was a pretty clear message from that press release.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that we see a lot of leaders talking about. This idea that we need to find a way to end conflicts peacefully and to redirect those resources towards more constructive purposes.
Absolutely. Now, was there anything else in that press release that stood out to you?
Well, yeah, they also mentioned the possibility of future cooperation in the Middle East.
Oh, right. That's right.
Which is interesting because that's obviously a very complex region with a lot of different players and a lot of different interests at stake.
Yeah, and it's a region where Russia and the U.S. have often, been on opposite sides.
Exactly. Yeah. So the fact that they're even talking about the possibility of working together there is pretty significant.
Yeah, it suggests that maybe there's some common ground that they could find.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even if it doesn't lead to anything concrete in the short term, it's at least a sign that they're willing to have that conversation.
Right, which is always a good first step.
Absolutely. Now, beyond that, they also talked about the potential for improving U.S. Russia relations more broadly.
Okay, so not just focused on specific conflicts, but the overall relationship.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Because the relationship between these two countries has been pretty strained in recent years.
Yeah, to say the least.
And so, any steps that they can take to improve that relationship is probably a good thing for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And did they mention any specific ways that they might try to improve those relations?
Well, they didn't get into specifics, but they did mention the possibility of future economic deals.
Oh, okay. So maybe, increased trade or investment or something along those lines.
Right, exactly. Which would be interesting because obviously there are a lot of sanctions in place right now targeting Russia.
Yeah, so that would be a pretty big shift.
Mm-hmm. It would definitely signal a major thaw in relations.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's pretty interesting stuff from the White House press release. But we also have Trump's perspective on this call. And there are a couple of different interviews that he gave that we can look at.
Yeah, he was pretty vocal about this one, wasn't he?
Yeah, he definitely had some things to say. So let's start with the interview he gave to the Washington Examiner.
Okay. Sounds good.
So in that interview, he characterized the conversation as very good. A big deal. He was pretty positive about it.
Yeah, he seemed quite pleased with how it went.
Yeah, and one specific point that he highlighted was this agreement for an immediate stop to strikes targeting energy and infrastructure.
Okay, so not a complete ceasefire, but a kind of a targeted de-escalation.
Right, exactly. It's important to clarify that, this wasn't a full ceasefire across all fronts.
Right, it was specifically focused on those critical infrastructure targets.
Did even so Trump, he really saw this as a significant first step.
Yeah, he was really framing it as the beginning of something bigger.
Yeah, he called it a very positive event and a good start. So, he's clearly optimistic that this could lead to further progress down the line.
Right, and that seems to be a strategy here. Start with something small, build some trust, and then hopefully work towards a broader agreement.
Yeah, and did he give any indication of when we might see that broader agreement?
Well, he said that he anticipates a full ceasefire happening in the appropriate time and pretty soon.
Okay, so not a specific timeline, but he seems to think it could happen relatively quickly.
Yeah, and he did add that it would depend on negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. So, it's not entirely in his hands.
Right, of course.
Okay.
But he does seem to believe that this initial agreement can create some momentum for those negotiations.
Exactly. He's hoping that this will be a catalyst for further progress.
Yeah. Now, another thing that Trump talked about in this interview was his confidence in his own ability to influence Putin.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme with him, isn't it?
It definitely is. He often talks about how he has this special relationship with Putin and how he can get him to do things that other leaders can't.
Right. And in this case, he specifically alluded to weighty reasons for Putin's agreement reasons that weren't present during previous administrations.
Oh, okay. So he's not saying exactly what those reasons are, but he's implying that he has some kind of leverage that others didn't.
Right. And whether that's true or not is open to interpretation.
Yeah, we can't know for sure, but it's definitely interesting that he's framing it that way.
Absolutely. And it's part of his broader narrative about his own deal-making abilities.
So what did he say about why he's so invested in this, in trying to de-escalate the conflict?
Well, he cited two main motivations. One was to prevent further loss of life, which is, a pretty understandable goal.
Yeah, of course. I mean, nobody wants to see this conflict continue indefinitely.
Right. And the other motivation he cited was his displeasure with the amount of U.S. financial support for the conflict.
Okay, so he's not happy with how much money is being spent.
Right. He mentioned a figure of around $350 billion spent with zero result, in his words.
Wow, that's a big number.
Yeah, and to the point that resonates with some people, this idea that the U.S. is spending too much money on foreign conflicts.
Yeah, and that those resources could be better used elsewhere.
Right. And he also voiced concerns about the potential for the situation to escalate into a third world war.
Okay, so he's really painting a picture of a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, he's definitely trying to raise the stakes here and to argue that his involvement is necessary to prevent a catastrophe.
All right, well, so that's a pretty clear picture of Trump's perspective on this phone call. But there's one more interview that we need to look at, and that's the one he gave to Fox News.
Right, ES picked up on that one.
Yeah, so E-Express reported on some of the key points from that interview, and it seems like he doubled down on some of the things that he said in the Washington Examiner interview.
Okay, so even more emphatic in his assessment.
Yeah, for example, he called the call with Putin magnificent.
Wow, so really laying it on thick there.
Yeah, and he also reiterated those warnings about the risk of a global conflict.
Right, so really trying to hammer home that point.
Yeah, and this time it was specifically mentioned that while the agreement was reached on energy infrastructure, it didn't extend to a broader 30-day ceasefire.
Okay, so he had apparently been pushing for a more comprehensive ceasefire, but Putin wasn't willing to go that far.
Right, exactly. So it was a partial agreement, but not the full scope that he had been hoping for.
But still, a step in the right direction from his perspective.
Right, and it's interesting that he was willing to accept that partial agreement, rather than just walking away from the table.
Yeah, it suggests that he's really committed to finding some kind of resolution here.
Now, beyond that, he also expressed his concern about the sheer volume of weaponry that's currently facing each other in the conflict.
Right. I mean, that's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah, and he called the war itself completely unnecessary.
So he's really placing the blame squarely on the shoulders of those who started the conflict.
Yeah, and that's a view that's shared by a lot of people, this idea that this war could have been avoided.
Right, and that it's causing a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Now, he also made this interesting distinction between trade relations with Russia and China.
Well, yeah, that's right. He talked about how there's a huge imbalance with China in terms of trade.
Right, whereas trade with Russia is much less substantial.
But he did note that both countries are interested in increasing trade.
Yeah, so maybe there's some potential there for some kind of economic cooperation down the line.
Right, and he also mentioned that Russia possesses very valuable resources, including rare earth elements.
Oh, okay. So that could be a factor in future economic considerations.
Exactly. I mean, those resources are in high demand globally.
So that's another interesting wrinkle to this whole situation.
Absolutely. All right. Well, so we've covered the official statements and Trump's perspective, but I think it's also important to look at how all this is being received by the public.
Yeah, because there are a lot of different opinions out there.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes this whole story so fascinating.
So They included a bunch of reader comments from various publications. So let's start with the Breitbart article. What were some of the main sentiments that you saw there?
Well, one viewpoint that came up a lot was this idea that Ukraine needs to capitulate in order to achieve peace.
Okay, so basically surrender to Russia's demands.
Right. And one commenter specifically called for sensible people to be involved in negotiations.
And they were implying that Zelensky isn't one of those sensible people.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a segment of the population that doesn't have a lot of faith in Zelensky's leadership.
And that thinks that he's the one who's standing in the way of peace.
Right. And there was also a lot of talk about the need for a durable peace.
Yeah.
Because people are just tired of this conflict.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's been going on for a long time, and it's caused a lot of suffering.
Exactly. And people are starting to feel like it's time to find a way to end it, even if it means making some compromises.
And we even saw a comment echoing the "Make Russia Great Again" slogan.
Oh, wow. So clearly some people are pretty firmly in Putin's camp.
Yeah, and seeing this whole situation as kind of a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia.
Right, and believing that Russia's the one that's in the right.
Now, another interesting comment that I saw was one that described Putin and Trump as two experienced negotiators acting like adults.
And they were contrasting that with meetings involving Zelensky.
Yeah, so the implication is that Zelensky is somehow immature or inexperienced.
Right, and that he's not really capable of negotiating on the same level as Putin and Trump.
And that Putin and Trump, that they can cut through the BS and get things done.
Exactly. And there's definitely a certain appeal to that narrative, this idea of two strong men coming together to solve the world's problems.
Yeah, but it also kind of ignores the fact that, there are a lot of other stakeholders involved in this conflict.
Right. And that Zelensky does represent a democratically elected government.
Yeah, so it's not as simple as just, two guys making a deal.
Exactly. All right. So moving on to the East Express article, what were some of the key themes that emerged from those comments?
Well, one sentiment that came up a lot was that the war shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Right, and people were citing a number of reasons for that.
Yeah, they talked about the high number of casualties, the economic crisis in Europe,
Yeah.
and this perception that the West is losing.
Right, and that the only ones who are really benefiting from this conflict are the arms manufacturers.
Yeah, so there's the sense that this war is serving no one's interests except for those who are profiting from it.
Right, and that it's just a tragedy all around.
Now, there were also a lot of comments that were critical of Zelensky.
Oh, yeah. Some people were really going after him.
Yeah, one person said that they hoped Trump could bring the crazy Zelensky to his senses.
Wow. So really questioning his mental state there.
Yeah, and another person suggested that Europe also needs to be brought to its senses because they're seen as fueling Zelensky's fantasies of omnipotence.
Okay, so they're blaming Europe for enabling Zelensky's supposedly reckless behavior.
Right, and portraying him as this kind of delusional figure who's out of touch with reality.
And there was even one comment that hailed Putin as the best politician in Europe.
Wow, so that's a pretty extreme view.
Yeah, and they said that they wished that the West had leaders like Lavrov and Zakharova.
So they're basically saying that they admire the Russian leadership.
Right, and that they see them as more competent and more effective than their Western counterparts.
Now, another interesting comment that I saw was one that urged Trump to reign in England, France, and Poland.
Oh, yeah, they were accusing those countries of hindering peace efforts.
Yeah, and specifically with actions in Kursk and Belgorod.
Okay, so they're saying that those countries are provoking Russia.
Yeah, and that they're making it harder to achieve peace.
And they also claim that the West has deceived Putin too many times.
So there's this sense of distrust and betrayal.
Right, and a belief that Russia has been wronged by the West.
And that Putin is justified in his actions.
Exactly. Now, finally, there was this one comment that suggested that if Trump and Putin managed to bring about genuine peace, they would deserve even greater recognition than Obama.
Wow. So really putting them on a pedestal there.
Yeah, and saying that this would be a historic achievement.
All right. Well, so as you can see, there's a real mix of opinions out there about this phone call and about the conflict in general.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that these comments are just a snapshot of a much larger conversation.
Right, and that they don't necessarily represent the views of the majority of people.
But they do give us some insights into the different perspectives that are out there.
Now, we also had this perspective from the Czech Republic, reported by Express.
Right, and that was a bit more nuanced, I would say.
Yeah, so the Ledovky newspaper They expressed concern that if Trump agrees to end aid to Ukraine as a condition for ending the conflict, then Putin will have effectively won.
Okay, so they're worried that Trump might make too many concessions to Putin.
Yeah, and that he might not demand enough in return.
Right. And they're seeing this as a sign of a shifting global order where, these kind of unilateral demands are more likely to be accepted.
So they're worried that this could set a dangerous precedent.
Right, exactly. That it could embolden other authoritarian leaders.
And make it harder to defend democracy and human rights around the world.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious concern.
All right, well, so that's a lot to process.
It is, yeah. But I think it's important to have these conversations.
Absolutely, because this conflict is, it's not just about Russia and Ukraine, it's about the future of the world order.
Exactly, and we need to be thinking critically about the different perspectives and the different potential outcomes.
All right, well, let's try to wrap things up here. What are the key takeaways that you see emerging from this whole situation?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that this direct communication between Putin and Trump is significant in and of itself.
Yeah, it shows that they're at least willing to talk to each other.
Right. And that's a good starting point.
And then there's the reported agreement on de-escalating attacks on energy infrastructure.
Right, which is a concrete step, even if it's a limited one.
Yeah, and it's something that could potentially build some trust and momentum for further negotiations.
And then, of course, we have the broader goal of achieving a lasting peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, but as we've seen, there are very different visions of what that peace would look like.
Right, and that's where things get complicated.
Yeah, because there are a lot of different interests at play and a lot of different perspectives on what a just and sustainable peace would entail.
Exactly, and that's something that we need to keep in mind as we continue to follow this story.
Now, finally, there's Trump's confidence in his ability to broker a resolution.
Right. He's definitely not lacking in self-belief.
Yeah. And it remains to be seen whether he can actually deliver on his promises.
Only time will tell. But it's certainly a situation that's worth watching closely.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with more analysis of the latest developments.
So stay tuned.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.